we going to talk about the 10 trees? I was intrigued to the answer.
Oh, the 10 trees. Right. I'll tell you the 10 trees. Yes.
Oh Lord,
Uh,
I found them all out and I wrote them down, and now I don't know where I put the piece of paper.
right. I'll tell you them in a minute.
I do that every 5 minutes.
I've got it.
Those who,
I've got it. I
yeah,
think.
1 second.
Yes, I've got it. Yeah, I found it.
Go on, which ones have you got?
I've got the Tree of Knowledge. I've got them in order where they come in the
Yeah,
bunch.
for those who missed this, the
I
question was.
cheated.
Sorry,
I
for those who,
cheated. I looked them up.
right. So for those who missed this, there was a question I asked the kids in Nigeria about the 10 trees that are mentioned in the Torah. So go on, which ones have you got? I didn't. Sorry, Lisa. I meant to reply on Facebook. The people who got them got 6 or 7 correct. Yes. Go on, Iris. Go on.
Tree of Knowledge.
Yeah.
Tree of Life.
Yeah.
The olive tree that the dove brought the twig from after the flood.
Yeah.
The tree under which Abraham sat when the angels came and told him about Sarah and had the baby.
Yeah. Yeah. Where you got shade. Yeah.
One I really didn't have a clue about. Apparently, when Simeon and Levi organized the killing of all the people of Shechem, the men of Shechem, and looted the place, Jacob buried the idols under a tree near Shechem.
Yeah, correct.
Then there was a tree under which Rebecca's nurse Deborah was buried.
Good, Alan Bachut.
I didn't agree with this one. I don't think a bush is a tree, but the burning bush.
Yeah.
The tree that sweetened the bitter waters of Mara.
Yeah.
And then apparently at the oasis of Elim, after the Mara, there were 70 date palms.
Right, 12 springs and 70 palms. And the last one is an interesting one.
And then there's the cedars used for building the Mishkan.
Right, I think some
apparently legend says that legend says that Jacob planted them on the way down to Egypt so that they could grow until they were needed.
Correct. Very good.
As I say, I'm sorry, I cheated.
No, you did very well. And to add to that, the kids in school said, well, the willow and the palm, the lulav. Couldn't argue with that.
Oh, of course, yeah.
As well. But that wasn't necessarily what we were thinking. There you go. So I knew about.
Did you mention Hagar?
The what? Sorry.
Oh yeah, she sat under a tree, didn't she?
Yeah, which tree was that?
A tree.
Acacia. Oh, hang on, wasn't that an acacia bush again? Acacia tree.
Possibly. So there we go. So feel free to look them up. Well done, Iris. Thank you. It was good.
But as I say, it was totally cheated. I just Googled it and wrote down the answers.
Well, what was nice was the kids knew a bunch of them, which I was really pleased with. Okay, so
I didn't actually get what the question was really. I was thinking when I went to the Google, it was because I couldn't think of more than olive and cedar. I was thinking in terms of what types of trees, not what specific tree.
Yeah. So that was that, and also just want to say, I was not challenged. I was contacted after last week. So a couple of times recently, I've said sort of tongue in cheek about ceasefires, and let's just be clear. I'm an advocate of peace. The peace I'm an advocate of is the peace envisaged by Isaiah, where people actually lay down their weapons sincerely and humanity lives in harmony. Until that happens, unfortunately, which we're going to learn about today probably, we have an impossible situation which nobody wants, where Israel finds itself in an existential conflict. And any proposal of a ceasefire, even if well-intentioned, unfortunately, usually inevitably involves placing Israel in danger. So when I use the term ceasefire, which I used in the sermon recently last week also, I was putting it in quotation marks as a reference to the coming of Mashiach. Until then, unfortunately, there are no easy choices. But anyone who has any understanding of the situation, I mean, I've made the mistake of getting into some silly discussions with people online recently, because when you post anything Jewish these days, people put Free Palestine on the bottom, and then someone puts from Hamas, and then someone else says Israel's just as bad, and then you have a whole discussion, and people really don't get it. There was a stupid thing. There was a stupid thing on the Oxfam page.
Yes.
There was a stupid thing on the Oxfam page about political failures which have led to this.
What's
And I
10?
comments. I said it's not a political failure. It's a murderous.
I have to get someone to
murderous.
remove me because my right arm doesn't work. Let me just mute myself.
Yes, please. It's a murderous group that wants to kill us. That's not a political failure. That's a, you know, and one of the problems is that we unfortunately, it's interesting because Rabbi Sylvester spoke Friday night and there was quite a lively discussion. And the people that said they didn't agree with what he said were saying, well, you have to make peace. And I'm saying you can't make peace with someone that basically is threatening to murder you if you don't defend yourself. It's a very, very difficult situation. I just want to clear up that point that I'm not advocating any kind of ceasefire that the UN is advocating. It sounds harmless, but the reality is a cessation of hostilities with a murderous group that wants to kill you basically enables them to, unfortunately, rearm themselves to kill you again. So there's no easy choices in these things, and I hope, please God, that it should all end peacefully, but peacefully in the genuine sense of the word, not what the UN means. Anyway, right, we're going to talk about that today, actually. So, why are we going to talk about it today? Because in this week's study actually talks about Amalek. Let's do the summary first, then we'll talk about Amalek a bit and things like that. Very topical, unfortunately. Right, it's not working. It's frozen as usual. Right, just keep chatting for a minute. Oh, come on.
Okay.
Oh, it's completely frozen. Oh, there we go. Right. Okay, Iris, over to you.
Soon after allowing the children of Israel to depart from Egypt, Pharaoh chases after them to force their return, and the Israelites find themselves trapped between Pharaoh's armies and the sea. God tells Moses to raise his staff over the water. The sea splits to allow the Israelites to pass through, and then closes over the pursuing Egyptians. Moses and the children of Israel sing a song of praise and gratitude to God. In the desert, the people suffer thirst and hunger, and repeatedly complain to Moses and Aaron. God miraculously sweetens the bitter waters of Marah, and later has Moses bring forth water from a rock by striking it with his staff. He causes manna to rain down from the heavens before dawn each morning, and quails to appear in the Israelite camp each evening.
Okay, one sec. Oh, come on. Yep.
The children of Israel are instructed to gather a double portion of manna on Friday, as none will descend on Shabbat, the divinely decreed day of rest. Some disobey and go to gather manna on the seventh day, but find nothing. Aaron preserves a small quantity of manna in a jar as a testimony for future generations.
We get a jar from.
In Rephidim, the people are attacked by the Amalekites, who are defeated by Moses' prayers and an army raised by Joshua.
Thank you. So, trigger warning, I should have said at the beginning, we're going to have a discussion which is a difficult one, not necessarily politically correct, but it's the reality, and it probably touches on, first of all, the whole Amalekite scenario, but also a lot of the issues that unfortunately we find ourselves facing in society today. You know, the biggest, I don't know if people really understand 9/11 in terms of what it meant to America. You know, in Israel, unfortunately, always used to terror attacks. In Britain, I grew up with the IRA, you know, bombings. In America, they haven't really faced domestic terrorism until 9/11. Americans always fought. I mean, it's ironic because crime rates are through the roof and, you know, gun crime and so on. But as a society, America always prided itself on being a safe, secure, free society. What 9/11 did was it completely eroded that sense of safety. Maybe in a similar way to 7th of October, Israelis felt that, you know, there was always a degree of safety and security, and that feeling was completely crushed. Right? So when planes flew into the center of New York and basically knocked down buildings, people suddenly realized how vulnerable they were. It was a watershed moment for American society. The other problem that 9/11 created and ISIS created and all these things create is that most of us see the world through our own eyes, right? It's
Sorry, what?
we see the world through our own eyes.
I think it means there is.
Hello?
No. What? Yeah, to throw in the bin. Yeah.
Okay. Going to ask people to mute if you're having conversations not about the share because I'm getting lost. There's so many conversations going on. By all means, don't mute, but if you need to chat, just mute for a minute because otherwise it just confuses me. Okay, so we tend to see things through our own eyes. It's human nature, right? We perceive things in our own way, right? This was one of the issues with the Rabbi Kiva students. They couldn't see things from somebody else's perspective, right? It's very hard to get, we often speak about clarity and getting clarity on things. So the classic example of that, of course, was Chamberlain, 19th, right? Peace in our time, right? Proudly waving a piece of paper which was worthless. Was Chamberlain a bad person? No, of course not. Right? What was his mistake? His mistake was thinking, I'm a reasonable man, I'm a decent bloke. Nobody wants to go to war. I'm a decent bloke. Most people are decent blokes. Most people want peace. I'm sure Hitler's a decent bloke. So we'll sign this treaty and everything will be fine. Right? Somebody made the comment Friday night, human beings want peace. So we just have to sit and talk. We make that assumption because we in the West, we as Jews value life. But unfortunately, not everyone does, right? Hamas certainly don't. So you're immediately starting on the wrong foot when you're having a conversation, when you're trying to say, right, or America after 9/11 saying, oh, we'll sit down and talk to ISIS and work it out. You can't, Al-Qaeda, you can't work it out. They don't follow the normal standards of society that most people do. So what happened after 9/11? People start saying it's a crime, it's an act of war, what is it? Right? And the question often asked is why do they hate us so much? Right? Why do people want to kill thousands of, in that case, Americans? Why do people have this, what motivates that? And in the West, we struggle with that. So thanks to Rabbi Sacks, there's a book by a chap called Lee Harris, who wrote a book called Civilization and Its Enemies. And he wrote a book called The Suicide of Reason. And he talked about this. And he said that one of the biggest problems we have in the West is that we've forgotten about the concept of an enemy. As liberal Democrats, we think that society, as long as everyone's prosperous, as long as everyone has money in their pocket, people won't want to rock the boat. So why would anyone resort to crime or hatred or, violence when there's a better way? The better way is to have a prosperous, thriving society, right? You can ask this question about Gaza, right? They're now finding hundreds of miles of tunnels, which would have cost millions of dollars to build. That money could have been spent, right? All these countries have been pouring money into Gaza on the assumption that Israel also assumed that if you give people universities, and you give them hospitals, and you give them, aid to build, then they'll be happy because they'll have prosperity. But unfortunately, what happens instead is it's channeled into extremism. So we assume that everyone's rational, everyone's decent because we're rational and decent. So we project it onto everyone else. There must be a solution to the problem. There must be a resolution to the conflict. And no one's going to want to start a war. No one's going to want to cause harm or hurt. So we'll sit down, we'll negotiate. And when it goes wrong, we ask ourselves often, what have we done wrong? And by the way, this is one of the things that you see now. There's a certain hand-wringing in liberal society, in Western society, people saying, what did we do wrong? Is it possible that you didn't do anything wrong? But unfortunately, it's a clash of cultures. It's East meets West. I was on a call earlier this morning. There's a big problem at the moment that I don't know if you've seen or heard. I probably mentioned it a few times in different contexts. That you would think after October 7th, forget Israel for a moment, but just forget Israel's response. October the 7th, you would think would have been a watershed moment where any decent human being would have said, this is disgusting. The people that have barely emerged from the Holocaust to go through those kind of atrocities again, we condemn it. And any right-thinking person, whether you're a Jew, a Muslim, right-wing, left-wing, Palestinian, Israeli, American, Russian, Ukrainian, doesn't matter. Any decent person is on the side of good, and any person who's an indecent person, not indecent, whatever, who's not a decent person, will be on the side of bad. You would think it would be a no-brainer, right? A slam dunk, as they say in America. And the Muslim community would stand up and say, we stand with, with the value of human life, and we stand with, freedom and all these things. And instead, there's been a deafening silence, right? And we seem to not want to face the reality that there is a bit of a, this goes beyond Israel. It's a clash of cultures. It's a clash of cultures. It's cultures that unfortunately have been imported from the darkest parts of the Middle East, which do not value British values like human life and democracy and freedom. If you look at I'm going to be a bit controversial. You look at I don't know if you're following all the stories of what's going on in various schools. The Barclay School in Leytonstone, or Leytonstone, I can't remember which.
Leighton.
It's got nothing to do with the Jewish community. Right? It's actually saying that they may have to shut the school and have lessons online. Why? Because as a result of refusing to allow a child to wear a Palestinian flag badge, because the school said, they don't have any Jewish people as far as I know, it's got nothing to do with that. They said that we do not allow expressions of political expressions in schools. Schools should be apolitical. Children shouldn't be, injected into this conflict. That they basically face death threats and bomb threats, and this is like, what world are we living in? We live in a democracy. You shouldn't, that's not acceptable. Or this school that, the lawsuit going on about the prayer. By the way, I would be very offended if I couldn't pray in public. But anyway, this lawsuit going on, again, they've had death threats and all kinds of stuff. And you think, think about Salman Rushdie. He's a very unpleasant fellow, but think about what he went through. And, think about the cartoons in France. And there's a common thread. And the common thread is, completely different culture from Western democracy. Now, I do remember when they were talking about Sharia law that the MP Keith Vaz, so I don't know if he's still an MP. Is he still an MP? Who was an MP for Leicester, who stood up and said something to the effect in Parliament of, I don't know about you, but my family came over here to get away from these extremists. And we want to live in a moderate society. We want to be moderate Muslims. The last thing we want is to import these extremists from the places that we wanted to escape from. So that's the moderate voice. But there's also, unfortunately, a lot of people who reject Western society and Western values. And Israel, to all intents and purposes, is a Western society in terms of being a democracy and placing value on human life and so on and so forth, and having freedom of the press, which comes back to bite it because they say nasty things about it. So it could be that, and that if you see what all the liberals are saying now about Israel, it's it's Israel is colonization, and America is the and I don't know, all this oppression and so on, and this whole kind of critical race theory and what is it, white privilege. No one can bring themselves to say. It might be that some people don't like us because unfortunately we stand on the right side of history. Yeah. So I'm not saying America's perfect, but sometimes people don't like you because of what you stand for. There's nothing you can do about it. You don't have to apologize. I don't have to apologize for what I stand for. I stand for good, and I stand for freedom, I stand for rights, and I stand for human life and dignity, and values. You don't have to apologize for that. The fact that someone else might have a problem with that, the fact that an extremist group has a problem with that because that interferes with their worldview. I mean, I'm not in any way excusing Hamas, and it took years, I'm sure, to plan what they did. But one of the things that's been said is they saw the way things were going in the Middle East, that most Arab countries were actually having a thawing of relations with Israel, the Abraham Accords, and this is a threat to their whole raison d'etre. So, who's in the wrong here? Israel didn't do anything wrong. The West didn't do anything wrong. The fact that people don't like what you're doing and what you stand for, and therefore they attack you, doesn't mean you have to suddenly go on a back footing and say, we're so sorry that we've upset you. Sometimes that might be the case, right? Sometimes you have an oppressed minority who are so oppressed that they feel they have no choice but to rise up. That's not the case with what's happening in society. And the reality is it's a culture clash between East and West, as it were. The darkest traditions of the Middle East, and I'm not saying the West is perfect either, it has its decadence and so on. And so let's see what this Lee Harris says, because it's really quite fascinating about how liberals see enemies versus the reality. So who'd like to read?
Ken, if you like.
Go on. Just before you start, so I haven't given the context. He starts off by saying this is how liberal society sees the world. So go on. Right.
An enemy is simply a friend we haven't done enough for yet. In the real world, presumably that's a response to the previous paragraph or something.
Yes. So if we could only give people, I don't know, more aid, or give them more rights, or give them better education, or give them more opportunities, then there wouldn't be any strife, and nobody would hate us, and nobody would want to not, drive planes into buildings or murder Israelis or whatever it is. Right. Just by the way, Israel's in the forefront of this, but make no mistake about it. If you look at any documents, you look at the Hamas Charter, you look at Al Qaeda, any of these things, Israel is the little Satan, America and the West is the great Satan. So it's not about it. Yes, it's anti-Semitic. Yes, it's anti-Israel, but there's a much bigger issue there in terms of hatred for the West. Right. So carry on. Yes. So yeah.
Okay. In the real world, however, not everyone is a liberal Democrat. An enemy is someone who is willing to die in order to kill you. And while it is true that the enemy always hates us for a reason, it is his reason, not ours. He sees a different world from ours, and in that world we're the enemy. Why do they hate us? They hate us because we are their enemy.
Right? Sounds so obvious, but I think it's something that Western society really struggles with. Yes, you can have one, okay? But I'm on my share, okay? It sounds so obvious. I think it's something we really struggle with. Right? Most people say, "What have we done? What did we ever do to hurt you? Why do you hate us?" Right? Which is a very valid question. Sometimes the answer is, unfortunately, you're never going to stop it. People are going to hate you precisely because of what you stand for. Right? You know, Hitler said the Jews gave the world a conscience. Do we have to apologize for that? Right? It's unfortunate. Right? Sometimes you can do something about hate. If people hate you because you are actually oppressing them, or people hate you because you've done a historic injustice to them, or people hate you because you are actually harming them in some way, then you can stop doing that. If people hate you basically for who you are and what you represent, right, then it's a bit of a problem. They hate you because they see you as their enemy. Why they see you as their enemy?
Rabbi,
Yeah.
what does Lee Harris say is a possible pathway out of that?
Oh, I don't know. I haven't read the rest of the book. We might see a solution. I'm afraid part of the answer to that is going to be there are times when you have to defend yourself unapologetically. Right? World War II was a disaster.
But war doesn't seem to cure that. Fighting people, destroying
but-
things doesn't appear to make
Right,
them like
so-
you anymore.
No, it doesn't, but it sometimes removes the threat. So we'll come back to Amalek in due course as well. So World War II was a disaster, right? It wreaked economic havoc on the world, took years to recover, right? 50 million people killed, I think, in World War II. So was Chamberlain not right with his peace in our time? It was great. Why didn't it work? It didn't work because Hitler didn't want it. Right? I think the great, with all the talk of what's going on in Israel, I don't know if anyone's following all the news, but two things which seem to have slipped under the radar. Number one, Russia's increasing belligerence, and people saying that, the next world war is going to basically be Russia against God knows who else, and they start invading other states. And the other one is Pakistan bombing Iran, which slipped under the radar as well. These are all countries, many of whom have nuclear weapons. So we definitely face a very uncertain, challenging time in the world. Look, is war futile? 100%. I definitely think so. Because ultimately, usually, eventually, you have to sit down and talk. I think the difference is, if you look historically, maybe this is where World War II is a good parallel. Wars took place between countries over land, and Britain, Argentina, and the Falklands. It's a terrible thing, and people lost their lives in the Falklands War. Are Argentinians evil? Should we, spit on Argentinians? And anyone that grew up in the 80s, every American film, the bad guys were always Russian, right? You think like the Rocky films, things like that. The propaganda, you didn't even realize at the time. Now the kids study it in media as an example of propaganda. The bad guys always had Russian accents because that was the Cold War. That was the context, right? But ultimately, eventually, people sit down and talk. It's just a shame that they end up sitting down to talk after the people have lost their lives in conflict, which seems extremely futile. On the other hand, you couldn't sit down and talk to Hitler because he had murderous ambitions and ridiculous ambitions and so on. I think we would probably say the same for Putin, and we have to say the same for Hamas. There's some people you can't talk to. The same way that we would accept that World War II was a necessary evil, and the blame lies with Hitler, not with. The blame doesn't lie with Chamberlain or Churchill. The blame lies with Hitler, right? The blame for the current situation, let's be quite clear, lies with Hamas. The blame for 9/11 lies with Al Qaeda. It sounds very childish to say, but whatever havoc is unleashed as a result of that, when countries have to defend themselves, that's on the people that started it. I'm sorry, that sounds very childish. That's on the people that started it. I've heard the comment many times. Well, Israel wasn't bombing Gaza on October the 6th. People say, 85 years of oppression. Sorry, Israel was not bombing Gaza on October the 6th. Right? If October 7th hadn't happened, the resultant conflict and any loss of life would not have happened. Right? And it's interesting. I went to a shir at Aleinu where Ryan Zobin, who's recently joined the basin, spoke about different halachic justifications for war. And one of the things that we find mentioned occasionally in halacha is a war of revenge, where people are just so incensed by what's happened that they go on the rampage. And I just thought that was really interesting because the whole argument has been that's not what the present conflict is. The present conflict is not Israel saying we're going to get you back because we're really upset. It's Israel saying we have to protect and defend ourselves, and this is a just cause and a just war. Just by the way, it's interesting. I didn't plan to get all political today, but it's on our minds. When Rabbi Sylvester spoke Friday night, a couple of people said both, like in the questions and answers, and afterwards, well, you've got this crazy right-wing government in Israel that's making all these. Let's be under no illusions. And I did say to him afterwards, he said 100%. The most left-wing government in Israel right now would be waging that same war. No Israeli government in their right mind is going to capitulate to Hamas, who have stated their intention quite clearly. So it's not a right-wing, left-wing divide. Sometimes things are right-wing, left-wing divide, but it's not. There's no easy answer to it other than the coming of Mashiach. It's a horrible situation. We know that people's lives are at risk, including particularly soldiers that are going into battle, many of them 18, 19, 20-year-olds, that some of whom are own family and friends that we know. Of course, we would rather that wouldn't be the case. I'm sure I'm not the only one that one of the most painful things when you read the mainstream media and social media is the Israel portrayed as this, expansionist, imperialist colonizer that just wants to go and, cause extreme harm to Palestinians. I know that there might be one or two people like that. The vast majority of people would much rather not have to go to war in Gaza, particularly since people going to war are their own children, their grandchildren, and husbands and wives and what have you. So it's a complete mischaracterization. But, sometimes doing nothing is unfortunately worse. Sally's right. War is not a good option. We've discussed this before. If war was to be celebrated, then we wouldn't beat our swords into plowshares when Mashiach comes, right? We'd build a military museum. But no, it says the weapons will be transformed because weapons are inherently a bad thing. David Amalek was told he couldn't build the temple because he was a warrior with blood on his hands, even though the battles he fought were those that God had sent him into battle, right? A Cohen in battle still becomes tummy from a dead body, even though it might be unavoidable. So war is definitely not an ideal situation by any means. Unfortunately, it goes back to the dawn of time. Until such time that Mashiach comes, I think we're going to probably still have wars. And people think in 2024, who would think there will be wars going on? And yet there are. So I don't know what Lee Harris says the answer is, but I think this is a very salient point. And we're going to come back to this about Amalek and the Parsha because that was the connection here. But we do make this terrible mistake of seeing everything through liberal, democratic, Western, I want to say Jewish eyes. It's not to say the same thing. That, places huge value on human life. We can't understand what motivates a person to be a suicide bomber because we have the exact opposite. That when the IDF sends its soldiers into battle, there's an implied social contract and there's an implied, sacred duty to make sure that you do everything in your power to protect them, make sure they come back in one piece. Right? So who in their right mind would be a suicide bomber? And yet that's a phenomenon we see time and again. It's a completely different mindset. So according to Lee Harris, they hate us because we're their enemy. It's not something we've done wrong. It's an important point there. So we think to ourselves, we have all the answers, right? Look, whenever America goes into battle somewhere, right? When, in Iraq and they try to impose democracy and it goes wrong, right? Israel thought that Gaza would become a democracy. It goes wrong. Why does it go wrong? Because we assume that everyone thinks that we're the greatest and we have all the solutions. And the trouble is that not everyone thinks that way. Sometimes that means we have to modify our behavior and our approach to things. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's unfortunately no answer to it. Right? If people hate us because we're inherently right and we represent good, and it's dark forces that hate us and want to harm us, then we can't capitulate, unfortunately. The irony is, if it was racism or transphobia or homophobia or any of these things, everyone would agree. Everyone would say 100%. Society cannot tolerate racism. There's lots of racists in society, unfortunately. Particularly older people tend to be a bit more bigoted or whatever. Doesn't matter. If it's something that we believe is unacceptable, we have to fight it, right? Climate change, right? We now live in a society that feels that climate change is essential to tackle that, right? If a sizable minority in the population says it's all rubbish, right? It's all a load of rubbish, right? What are you going to do about it? So you might change your policy. You might say, I'm sorry you feel that way, but we believe this is right, right? Vaccination. There are strong anti-vaccination forces and conspiracy theories about COVID vaccinations and masks, right? So some societies might, in America, there were big arguments about that. Right? Most of Europe said, I'm sorry you feel that way, but this is the reality and this is what we're going to do and this is public health and this is what we're going to follow. If you don't agree, it's too bad. You have to like it or lump it, right? You can say that in a Western democracy. People just go and they protest and they don't really do any harm. If you say it in the Middle East, like it or lump it, usually amounts to people killing you. It's a different mentality. Right? I saw this great quote here from someone called Richard Weaver. I don't know who he was, but here's the quote. Right? Who'd like to read that? Number 2.
You want to read it? I'll read. The trouble with humanity is that it forgets to read the minutes of the last meeting.
Right, I love this quote, right? People
Yeah.
always think people forget history so quickly, right? People forget. How often do people repeat the same mistakes? You say this is history repeating itself. But what happens at the end of this week's Parsha? The Israelites have escaped from the chariots of the Egyptian army, which is like, the military high tech of their day. Right? The sea divided, they crossed. The Egyptians basically were destroyed or they had to turn back. The Israelites sing this song of praise, they're free. Right? And what happens next? They're attacked by the Amalekites. This tribe of nomads living in the desert. And what happens? Moshe says to Joshua, lead the people in battle, and they win. And this is no ordinary battle. Egypt, with all the oppression that took place, there's no commandment to remember the battles with Egypt and the sinking of the Egyptian chariots and the victory. The commandment we have, rather bizarrely, is to remember Amalek. Let's see. Who'd like to read number 3?
I didn't read very much just now.
Go on, you go for it.
Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll, something to be remembered, and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Moses built an altar and called it, the Lord is my banner. He said, the hand is on the Lord's throne. The Lord will be at war with Amalek for all generations.
So let's just look at this for a minute. Egypt oppressed us for 400 years, right? The Amalekites attack us once. They're opportunists. The Egyptians Pharaoh killed every male child. It was genocide. Surely, who should you remember as your oppressor? Amalek? Amalek was a chancellor that came along last minute. They were a tiny splinter group compared to the Egyptians. And yet the Torah tells us you must completely remember and blot out the name of Amalek and remember what he did. And as for Egyptians, let's see what it says about Egyptians in Devarim. Who'd like to read number 4?
Well, really, Rabbi, wasn't the Egyptians? It was Pharaoh who was oppressing the people, not the Egyptians themselves, wasn't it? Whereas with Amalek, it was a whole lot of them, not just their leaders.
Okay, but could be. Let's see. Right. Who'd like to read number 4? Hold that thought, Iris.
I'll read it if you like.
Go on.
Do not abhor the Egyptian because you were a stranger in his land.
So wait a minute. The Egyptians, who were so horrible to us for 400 years, we're told that you shouldn't hate them because you were a foreigner in his land. It's almost like saying he looked after you. What? Now, Amalek, let's have a look. We need some italics here. I didn't put italics in, unfortunately. I'm going to read it with some emphasis. Remember what Amalek did to you along the way when you came out of Egypt. When you were weary, bold, and worn out, they met you on your journey. They attacked those who were lagging behind. Okay, that should be in bold. They had no fear of God. You should blot out the name from under the heavens. So, we're not commanded to hate Egypt, but we are told never to forget Amalek. What's the difference? The difference is this. Let's see what it says in Pirkei Avot. Who'd like to read number 6? Who hasn't read yet?
Rabbi. If love depends on a specific cause, when the cause ends, so does the love. If love does not depend on a specific cause, then it never ends.
So it's the same with hate. When you have hate that's based on a specific thing, then it can end if the cause disappears. But if you have baseless hate, it lasts forever. Why did the Egyptians oppress the Israelites? Was it genocidal, racist hatred? We know why they did. You mentioned Pharaoh. What was Pharaoh's concern? Who'd like to read number 7?
Shall I read?
John?
Who said that?
Iris, we're back to you.
The Israelites are becoming too numerous and strong for us.
Right. We know this was paranoid, but Pharaoh said, they're going to take over one day. So I'm not justifying his genocide, but it was fear, right? After you hear people say, I was really fearful of, I don't know, ultra-Orthodox Jews, and I met some of the really nice people. I was really fearful of immigrants, but actually I met some of the really nice people, right? So Pharaoh's, there was a logic there. It wasn't irrational, right? They were fearful that the Israelites could become a threat to them, and therefore they tried to contain that threat. They were wrong, they were evil, but we understand somewhat what was going on. The Amalekites, the children of Israel were weary, they were worn out, they attacked the people who were lagging behind. The Egyptians feared us because we were strong. The Amalekites attacked us because we were weak. Put it another way, the Egyptians were acting rationally, the Amalekites were not. So when someone's acting rationally, a rational actor, you can negotiate peace with them. They might be in conflict with you, but at some point they'll realize that peace is a better option, right? Sadat is an example of that, right? Sadat was a statesman. He gave it, ultimately paid with his life, right? He was genuine when he came to the Knesset in Israel. That wasn't a fake. That wasn't a ruse. He saw that peace was the way forward. That's a statesman, right? I highly question whether Arafat, although he officially made peace, gets the same moniker, right? So that was a true statesman that put himself on the line because he believed that was the right way forward. So you're going to say, oh, but we had a war with him. So how can we make peace with him when we had a war with him? The answer is that when someone has genuinely seen the error of their ways and they've realized this is not the right path, then you can make peace with them. When someone's not acting rationally, Amalek, what's Amalek's problem? We didn't do anything to them. It's irrational, baseless hatred. And guess what? The Torah says you have to destroy Amalek. You have to fight it. The person who comes to you that you can't talk to, you can't reason with them because it's irrational, it's baseless, you're not going to make peace with them. It's not going to work. They say at the end of the Second World War, there was a period of time when the German army diverted trains carrying their own supply trains for their army to transport Jews to the death camps, right? So they messed up their own logistics because of their hatred. Right? Their army didn't get the supplies they needed. I don't know the exact statistics for this, but this is what they said. They didn't get the supplies they needed because they were so caught up in their hatred of Jews that they'd rather more Jews die in the camps than have supplies to the military. How do you reason with someone like that? Of course you don't. You can't. If somebody would have said the biggest problem in World War II was no one knew how to negotiate with Hitler, what are you talking about? How do you negotiate with someone that's basically determined to wipe you out? It's an awful thought, but you can't. This is the Amalek paradigm. It's not somebody that hates you because you're on their land, or they hate you because they fear your strength because you have lots of kids, whatever. It's somebody that hates you just because. It's a baseless, irrational hatred. There's no reasoning with such a person. So maybe that's why Amalek, that's why we're commanded. What are we commanded to do with Amalek? There's two things. One is to wage war, and the other is to remember. Now, if you look at Maimonides,
Hello.
Yeah, I'm still here. Oh, sorry, by the way, we see this also, by the way, what I was saying about the Nazis and redirecting their trains. The Nazis redirecting their trains. We see this also with Pharaoh, by the way. Eventually, we got to a point where it says that his own advisor turned in and says, "Do you not realize that Egypt is ruined?" And he didn't care because of his hatred, right? That's a dictator. But, right? I mean, look, objectively speaking, I don't know what Hamas's goal is because they're not going to survive. They cannot possibly survive this current conflict because God forbid they survive, there will be no Israel. So they've got to basically be destroyed. There's not going to be peace until the threat is removed. So Hamas went into this war basically knowing full well they're probably not going to survive. So the only thing I can say to you is that they must have such extreme pathological hatred of Jews and Israel, they're prepared to even give up their own lives for it. It makes no logical sense. So what about Amalek? So Maimonides says that the commandment to destroy Amalek was not a blanket, by the way. It was if they refused to make peace and to accept the Noahide laws. He also said that basically after the time of Sancherib, when all the nations got all mixed up, you couldn't even identify Amalek anyway. So he said, interestingly, Maimonides says it doesn't apply to just an enemy of the Jewish people. So people might say Hitler's like Amalek. That might be true, but the biblical command evidently doesn't apply according to most sources. So the war against Amalek, practically speaking, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't, have to wage war against someone who is a threat to you. But generally speaking, the war against Amalek, in terms of the nation of Amalek, doesn't apply nowadays. What does apply is to remember and not forget what Amalek did. And we do that. We read it at least twice a year, called Shabbat Zachor. So what are we doing there? We're saying that in times of peace, it's easy to forget what hatred lies beneath the surface. Remember what Amalek did to you. What did Amalek do to you? Amalek attacked you when you were no harm to them, no threat to them. They attacked the weak, they attacked the women and children. They had complete disregard, they behaved completely irrationally with complete, utter hatred. Remember what they did to you. Today, when we face terror and hatred, seems extremely applicable. Remember Amalek. Never forget that unfortunately there are those who simply hate you, and there's nothing you can do about it. You know, we say, oh, what did we do wrong? What do we do to upset them? You know, why are they so angry with us? In many cases, many Jews, right? Unfortunately, there's a whole liberal, kind of Jewish liberal movement in this country as well, particularly in the States, that sees Israel as, you know, a white colonizer, and the whole problem stems from our oppression of Palestinians because we took their land, etc., 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 right? Which is, you know, a vast oversimplification of things. Remember what Amalek did to you. Remember that there are sometimes people that are just murderers. And actually, what do we do in the Bible? We didn't make peace with Amalek. We had to wage war. Sometimes you have to defend yourself. Maybe that's the message. Let's see what this chap says. Don't know who he is, but anyway, one of Rabbi Sacks' many people he quotes. So, Mr. Waltzer. Don't know. Anyway, who'd like to read? Julian, have you read yet?
I'll read.
No. Go on.
Wherever we see terrorism, we should look for tyranny and oppression. The terrorists aim to rule, and murder is their method. They have their own internal police, death squads, disappearances. They begin by killing or intimidating those comrades who stand in their way, and they proceed to do the same if they can among the people they claim to represent. If terrorists are successful, they rule tyrannically, and their people bear without consent the costs of the terrorists' rule.
By the way, I don't know if anyone's seen, it's starting to emerge now, clips, videos, and messages from people in Gaza, a lot of messages from Israeli Arabs or from moderate Muslims around the world saying things like, you know, you want to help us? Help defeat Hamas, because they're the biggest oppressors of all. You want to help us? You know, don't attack Israel, attack Hamas. You know, I'm saying both, like metaphorically and physically. You know, the voices are starting to be heard, not enough, but they're starting to be heard. So a lot of clips out there of Israeli Arabs, very, you know, saying, you know, apartheid state, what are you talking about? I'm a female doctor in a hijab and I work in a hospital in Israel, and I probably couldn't do that in most countries in the Middle East. I have the vote and I could become prime minister one day if I wanted to, you know, and all this kind of thing. And people are completely missing the point, unfortunately. They're completely missing the point. The greatest oppression, not Israel, it's Hamas, and probably the Palestinian Authority as well. It's a tragedy. It's a terrible tragedy. The people who claim to speak up for the oppressed are actually guaranteeing their continued oppression. It is an absolute tragedy and travesty, unfortunately. So this is why it says you have to remember Amalek. Remember what he did to you. Remember that irrational hatred. Remember that unprovoked attack. Right? Don't remember the Egyptians who hated you because they saw you as a threat. Yes, they were evil and murderous, but once the threat was gone, they left you alone. They tried to chase you because Pharaoh wanted his slaves back. Egypt's no longer a threat. Amalek attacked you for no other reason than just out of baseless hatred. Those are the people you need to fear. Amalek attacked the women and children. Sound familiar? Attacked you when you were weak and weary. Amalek's someone you can't make peace with. You can't sit down and talk to, unfortunately. Sound familiar? That's why you have to remember. Unfortunately. Nobody likes that view. Right? We all like a view of the world where everyone's peaceful and everyone likes to talk and everything can be resolved through diplomacy. That's not always true. So Lee Harris again, his book, he said the subject of his book is forgetfulness. And he ends with the question, can the West overcome forgetfulness? It is the nemesis of every successful civilization. Comes back to that comment before about not reading the minutes of the previous meeting, right? People very conveniently forget. Right? It's much easier to forget, to pretend things haven't happened. You know, Netanyahu's had a policy for a number of years of containment of Hamas. Every time there's a little blow up, you know, they do a token thing. Israel does, you know, it flexes its muscles, and everyone goes back to relative peace and calm and quiet. The problem is we now see that during that peace and calm and quiet, Hamas has been preparing for an onslaught of violence, unprecedented violence. And they've said time and again they will repeat it. Right? How do you negotiate peace with someone who keeps saying we will do it again? You can't. The only conclusion you can draw is you have to make sure that person is unable to do that. Now, if it happens to be that the UN or the USA or somebody has enough influence to disarm that person, to stop them, what is the peace? You might say to me, are you saying the only resolution is war? No, there is a peaceful resolution. Let the United Nations, instead of condemning Israel, let the United Nations go into Gaza, disarm Hamas, arrest all terrorists, dismantle all rocket launchers and weapons, so there's no longer a threat to Israel. There you go. You could do that peacefully if they would surrender, but they're not going to. So there is a peaceful solution. People keep saying, there's a simple solution to this conflict: return the hostages and stop attacking Israel. That's also true, though I think it's more fundamental than that. So unfortunately, this message of Amalek, possibly the military message, although Amalek in its biblical form doesn't exist nowadays, you say, but certainly this idea that, remember, why do you have to remember what Amalek did to you? Because it's such a paradigm for the future. Don't forget what basis hatred is. Don't make the mistake of thinking, as we do in the West, it must be our fault somehow if we only give them more aid, or we only apologize for existing, or we only, basically crawl up and die, then everything will be okay. It's not true. It doesn't work that way, unfortunately. It just doesn't work that way. And the only way you're going to resolve it, often freedom means fighting for something you believe in. And sometimes, unfortunately, that means very dangerous people who are a threat to your freedom. The answer is not to negotiate with terrorists, unfortunately. That's just not the answer. It never has been. It never will be. So there isn't a good outcome to any of this other than the coming of Mashiach. But certainly the mistaken view that coming back to the original point, which we all do, right? I don't know, if someone, God forbid, breaks into your home and starts threatening you with a weapon, you're tempted to say, "Come on, we can talk about this." Well, this person obviously doesn't believe in talking because they're pointing a gun or a knife at you. So it's slightly naive to try to talk to such a person. Someone says, "I'm going to stab you." The answer is, "Let's talk about this." No, I want to stab you. Okay, there's clearly nothing to talk about. Right now, you have to defend yourself. If you get to a point where the person realizes their behavior is futile, they may then talk to you. But in the heat of the moment, they're not going to talk to you. And it's naive to think so. It's ridiculous. Right? It'd be lovely if holding hands and singing Kumbaya was the answer to everything, right? But it's not. It's not. Yes, war is horrible. It's awful. Sometimes it's the least worst option, unfortunately, I would say. But it's a difficult topic, but it ties into the Parsha. Sorry, it said more about Israeli politics than I usually do. I feel quite strongly about it. But I think I do also feel very strongly. I hope this isn't an apolitical view. I feel very strongly that whoever's in power in the West and whoever's in power in Israel, that we live in a very difficult world, and if we don't recognize evil for what it is when we see it, instead of apologizing and capitulating, we say, "You are a threat to our way of life. You are a threat to our values and our decent civilization and our freedoms, and we will not accept it. And if we have to fight you, we will," rather than capitulating. Unfortunately, the approach of the West at the moment seems to be to capitulate, which in the long term is going to be horrendous. I don't have the answers, but I hope that peace descends soon in some form or another. Anyway, any questions or comments?
No, I think you've said what we all feel, and thank you very much for that.
It's a difficult topic. I hate. No one wants to feel that way. We think in 2024 we shouldn't have wars anymore. Have the United Nations post-World War. Why are we still facing? It's not just Israel. It's Russia and Ukraine and Iran and China and so many places. So we very much need Mashiach. Unfortunately, not unfortunately. Yeah. I think is the answer to all these things. Anyway. In the meantime, please God, Israel should do what it has to do as quickly as possible, as painlessly as possible for all concerned. Nobody wants to see people losing their lives. On either side, of course we care about Palestinian lives. The difference is we see the solutions being different from how they see it. Anyway, and please God, everyone should get home safely, all the hostages and all those in Bacol. And,
yes,
soon,
think about the hostages all the time.
Yeah, don't even want to think about what they're going through,
No.
Anyway, just a reminder that if you want to hear more of the same, Rabbi Sacks is speaking loud and short, always very good, tonight at 8 o'clock.
Yes, we're going. We've registered. We're going.
Excellent. Good. And, we